Wow, Walter, 160 plus shows since I spoke to you last. So much has happened in the world. So many new findings. I'm going to refer people back to the original show we did. We did a great show on Lost Star of Myth and Time. We could talk for hours and hours about the astronomical data and precession of the equinox and ancient cultures, Walter. There's so much in this. I guess tell little people about you, Walter, that I haven't heard the first show, and tell us about the Binary Research Institute and what you do there.
Sure, and then we can talk about some of the new discoveries
Sure,
also.
Sure.
Yeah, by way of background, I'm the director of the Binary Research Institute, and that's where we look at solar system motion and its effect on cycles of time and consciousness. Mm-hmm. So just as the Earth spins on its axis and it gives you the cycle of day and night, and our bodies are adapted to that, so we actually go into a subconscious state during the night, and plant life shuts down, photosynthesis doesn't occur, blah, blah, blah. And just as the Earth orbits the sun in 365 days and causes the cycle of the seasons, mm-hmm. and again, more profound things happen, trillions of things spring out of the ground, bloom, fruit, then decay again, and billions of other larger life forms will migrate or spawn en masse. Mm-hmm. And we hardly think about it, but it's caused just by these simple celestial motions. So the ancients seem to be fascinated by a third motion, one that is very obscure nowadays, called the precession of the equinox. But according to Giorgio de Santillana, the former professor of the history of science at MIT, mm-hmm. He said that over 30 ancient cultures were aware of this cycle and seem to all relate it to the rise and fall of civilization.
Hamlet's Mill, he wrote.
Pardon?
Hamlet's Mill. He wrote the awesome book, Hamlet's Mill.
Exactly. Yeah. It's outstanding. I had to read it 3 or 4 times because it's so deep.
Sure.
It's a treasure trove of information on this idea that ancient cultures around the world believe that history or consciousness would rise and fall in this vast cycle of time with the precession of the equinox. It takes, roughly 24,000 years. And so, a little over 12,000 years before our last dark age, you had a golden age. Mm-hmm. And then we had the pit of our dark age, roughly 500 AD or so. And we've been creeping out of it since then with sort of a burst of activity with the Renaissance. That means, rebirth of the cycle. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so we're back on the upswing. And of course, Plato called this the great year. And so in the first film I did, we called it the great year, using Plato's terminology. But really, James, so many cultures talked about it in so many ways. And it's the Indians who have the most detail on it. They break it into the Kali, Dwapara, Treta, and Satya Yugas, and give us just a rich amount of information that can be really helpful to living our lives nowadays, I think, when we properly understand this larger cycle.
Walter, with the Binary Research Institute, you don't mess around. You've got a lot of astronomical scientific research papers and a lot of great minds in the Institute. Now, the thing is, do you come at this from a consciousness, spirituality point of view and look for the science to marry or match in with the evidence from ancient cultures or the sophistication of what these guys had? Or do you come at it from an astronomical point of view and then sometimes later match in the ancient evidence?
That's a good question. When I was a little boy, I read about history. My mom bought me a lot of books on ancient cultures, and I'd read about how advanced Sumer, Akkad, Babylon were. They had sewer systems, indoor plumbing, and same thing with Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, the Indus Valley. They built with uniform brick systems and, again, had tremendous waterworks. And both of these cultures, as well as the Egyptian culture and many others, just almost became nomadic civilizations by the time of the Dark Ages. And yet in school they taught me, well, things are pretty linear. This is the way things work. And I just thought it didn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
So it was always in the back of my mind. And then I came across a spiritual book, The Holy Science by Swami Sri Yukteswar.
Mm-hmm.
And he's explaining, the Enlightenment process. And just a matter of fact, in the introduction of the book, almost in passing, he says that, the reason mankind doesn't understand these things right now is because we're in a low age, and this age is caused by our solar system moving around another star, and we're farther from it. We're, close to the dark ages, and we're closer to it. We're in a higher age.
Wow.
And so that was the sort of the clue, the cue that got me just find out if this is true, then it's the most astounding information I've ever heard. It explains, why history has cycles in it. And that's when I formed the Institute, 12, 14 years ago now.
Wow.
And started hiring astrophysicists, astronomers to really seriously look into this. And sure enough, we found that the current theory of precession is just riddled with holes, so much so that they change it every 10 years.
Wow.
And Newton's equations didn't even work, his original equations. So nowadays they have 4,000 inputs into this precession model to try to predict the changing rate of precession each year.
I think sorry, Walter, I think one of the most important things is, everybody thinks that precession is figured out, and we really never had a clue about it in the first place, and still have very little clue about it today. I think you're pioneering a lot of stuff. You actually, I got to bring in Gravity Probe B, because this, Walter, for me is like fascinating that, you actually had correspondence with these guys, about the Gravity Probe B. So maybe talk a little bit about that, Walter.
Yes. So, we figured out that, precession can be better explained by this, the motion of the solar system rather than the simple wobbling of the Earth. And, that means that precession occurs even if you're off the planet Earth and, off the wobbling Earth. And, so Gravity Probe B, it was a program by Stanford and NASA to test Einstein's theories. They thought if they could get this perfect gyro off the planet Earth, that they'd get away from all motions, and they could really test, whether or not the Earth itself bends space-time. Mm-hmm. And I think they spent $800 million or something. And I realized, wow, that's going to be a very interesting experiment, but they're going to get some screwy data, because if precession occurs off the Earth, then it just won't make sense to them. So I wrote them a letter, mm-hmm. and it was before the spacecraft launched, and then, they got data for about a year, and then they finally write me back and said, hey, this is kind of interesting. Why don't you come on up and visit us? So I did. I went up there and visited with 5 or 6 astronomers, astrophysicists in a room. And they really took this idea seriously. Now, they said, since we don't see anything like a brown dwarf, maybe it's a black hole or something, and they actually got excited about that. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But it was clear that they hadn't even thought about different alternative theories to precession when they spent the $800 million to put this aircraft up there. And it's just one piece of the whole thing. I think even a more compelling piece, James, is, we put together this alternate model to try to plot the changing rate of precession. And so let me try to explain this in layman's terms.
Yeah.
If you look at a constellation and you see the sun moving through it on the equinox, it appears to be moving very slowly. So 4,000 years ago, the sun in the spring equinox would have been in Aries. 2,000 years ago, it was in Pisces, and of course now it's in the dawning of the age of Aquarius, which the 60s songs makes reference to. But it goes so slow, only 1 degree per 72 seconds that the average person really doesn't notice it. But we do have very fine instruments here on Earth, VLBI, very long baseline interferometry, where we're plotting how the Earth moves relative to very distant stars. And we see that the rate is moving up. It went up from, 50 arc seconds per year 100 years ago to 50.1 arc seconds per year 75 years ago to 50.2 arc seconds per year,
wow.
50 years ago, and 50.3 arc seconds in the last 25 years. And now it's, going towards 50.4.
Implies a speeding up process then, Walter.
Yeah, it's speeding up. It's basically any two objects that orbit each other or a common center of mass follow Kepler's laws, and they speed up when they get closer to the mass, and they slow down when they get farther apart.
Wow.
But the current wobble theory has no way to explain that. So they've added in all these inputs, like not just the sun and the moon tugging on the Earth, but Jupiter and passing asteroids, and plate tectonics, geological motions, volcanoes, everything, until they now have about 4,000 inputs, and so that they can try to make the answer to their equation come out with what's actually happening in the sky.
Wow. It don't seem right, Walter. It don't seem right what they're doing.
Yeah, we took a totally different approach. We only use about 6 variables, not 4,000. And we say, if it's a 24,000 year orbit and the low point was roughly 500 AD, that's when we were moving the slowest. It should be speeding up. Based on the rate we see the last few hundred years, we can predict how it will be. And sure enough, it's just following it to a T. Our model is 43 times more accurate.
Wow.
And thousands of times simpler.
Wow. So Walter, okay, we've got this precessional effect. I pretty much accept with the data that I see available today, that we have a large body doing this to us. Now, let's say the solar system is under precession. It's not just this moon Earth thing that we're told. The solar system's under precession. It must be a really heavy body. Forgive the simple language, but it must be a really heavy body doing this. There's various heavy bodies at various distances that could be the culprit. So we could have like a dwarf, a red dwarf, a black hole, or maybe some unknown electrogravitic theory of another distant star having some unknown effect. I mean, what's the best bet on this, Walter?
Well, that's a good question. So in my book, Lost Star of Myth and Time, I'm going to look at the sort of the two main angles. One, that it's a visible star that we haven't discovered yet, therefore probably a brown dwarf, maybe a red dwarf towards the galactic center where there's a lot of noise, or some, maybe even one of these new exotic stars, a Prion or something that's sort of still theorized but supposed to be very, very small. And then the other side would be, looking at nearby visible stars, and which requires the solar system to be moving faster than expected. And of course, there are some recent studies out to show that that is indeed the case. And so both theories, you have astronomers kind of looking at both ways. The visible way, the whole MOND crowd, this modified Newtonian dynamics group, is more in that camp. Whereas your invisible ones, you have some of your mainstream astronomers that are using classical Newtonian dynamics. And that camp has had sort of a new life brought to it lately.
Yeah.
Not because they're so concerned about precession. I mean, most of them aren't even aware of the problem. But because Mike Brown at Caltech has been finding all these minor planets, these dwarf planets. There's Quorar and Sedna, and what's the latest one? They're calling it Biden.
Yeah. 2012, yeah. I think they got this one.
Yeah. And because of the position of those dwarf planets and the periodicities of their orbits, it's very obvious that they're not being controlled by the sun. I mean, things around, the planets that we know, the 8 planets, are pretty much all in the same plane. They're heavily influenced by the sun. But as you get farther out, something else is influencing them, and so they go off plane. Pluto's 17 degrees off plane. These other ones I mentioned are off plane. They're kind of all sort of leaning towards Sirius, if you will.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, Mike Brown, he discovered. Oh, well, he killed off Pluto. He was famous for killing Pluto, and he said that Sedna can't exist without something else an unseen body doing something to it. So.
Yeah, and he was sort of the lone wolf saying that at first, and now these 2 Spanish astronomers just came out, in the last month or 2, saying that it's got to be something at least 10 masses, 10 Earth masses, so pretty big.
Wow.
And they think because there's they have to explain several of the dwarf planets, they're now looking for 2 objects that are that large. And I think what they're not considering is that the whole solar system is moving.
Yeah.
And
it's crazy, isn't it? I mean, it's like you have 2 camps, one with like a really good line of evidence and inquiry and an open mind, and then you got guys that are supposed to be in the front line that are lacking. It's crazy, and it's like neither one accepts the other. Well,
yeah, well, and they kind of each camp keeps the other somewhat on their toes. So this is the way science progresses, and so I don't know if it happens in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, but sometime, probably in our lifetimes. Mm-hmm. We'll realize that the solar system is moving, and there's something big out there.
I often think about it, and it's like there's so much moving out there, Walter. It's not just the Earth going around the sun, but the sun's flying around. It's not. We actually model the solar system as if the sun is a stationary object. However, it moves around the galactic center as well. Yeah. So and bobs up and down, and so it's like everything you look at out there is moving, Walter.
Yeah, without a doubt. And, when we have just barely beyond the Copernican system, you don't think about these things at first, but the more we expand our consciousness, we look outward, the more our instruments develop, the more you can't ignore these things that are happening on a very large scale and their influence.
Why do you think then, Walter, the ancients were so obsessed with precession? And I don't say that in a way like too lightly. I mean, they really were. I mean, everywhere you look at all these ancient cultures, Walter, they were obsessed with precession. They wanted to measure it. They were looking at it, encoding it into their structures. I think, do you think they were looking at a stellar reason for this, and we're kind of just catching up with that?
Yeah, I think because in modern society, precession has been totally disconnected from its effects. We think it has no effects. And yet, just as we use the spinning Earth, one spin is 24 hours. That's our entire basis of time. Yeah. We measure everything with that. Or one orbit of the Earth is a year, and it can tell you, when to plant crops, when to go fishing, when it's going to get cold and you need to prepare for such and such. So there's a lot of useful information when you understand the effects of these celestial cycles. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's why they were so interested in precession, not just to simply watch the sun move through the star, but to realize, we're in a declining age now. Things are going to get tough. And there's all this myth and folklore and stories about, the Indians, the sages and saints realizing this and taking off for the Himalayas and building fortresses and things like that. And sure enough, the Dark Ages were horrible. Look at 600 years ago. Every planet, every nation on Earth is at war with one another. Plagues, rage, justice is meted out by inquisition and dictators and beheadings and just
Wow.
horrible things. And it's, every county's fighting with each other. The lifespan is half of what it is now. And, I'm not saying that everything's perfect now, but that things are a lot better. We're going in the right direction.
We're on the upstroke. We're on the upstroke, I think, now, Walter.
Yeah, we're on the upstroke, and but it's a long, slow process. We're only 1,500 years from the depths of the Dark Ages, and we're still 10,500 years to go to the Golden Age. And,
yeah.
The saints and sages say you go through these different phases in between: the age of the hero, the age of the demigods, the age of the gods. And so I think trying to find out what's coming was of great interest to the ancients, and the Sumerians wrote about this a lot in their cuneiform texts. And so when they would find, these very old artifacts and buildings and stuff, they would always say, "Don't change anything by more than an eyelash."
Wow.
And they were trying to hang on to the past.
Yeah. They used to, didn't the Egyptians lament that they would fall from grace one day, that they would, I think a lot of civilizations did, they were lamenting they would fall from grace, that they would fall into and descend into the Dark Ages. They knew that. They used to write about it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's, imagine if we were all playing a game in a forest and having fun, and we could see each other and we were throwing the ball or the frisbee or whatever. And then it gets very dark, you can't play that game. You start stumbling over stuff. You're hurting yourself.
Sure.
The environment affects mankind. And so I'm saying that there's nothing fatalistic about these cycles. These are just the cycles that affect our environment. But if we know what's coming,
mm-hmm.
we can better prepare and, even succeed at certain type of businesses and things like that.
Sure. I think in an astrological sense, I think that, astrology and the yearly motion is a planetary effect. I can accept that, and I can also extrapolate that to a precessional effect being like a larger version of that, where we rise and fall in consciousness because of a grander cycle. It's another planetary effect or a solar system effect. I've no problem accepting that. I think we all have free will as humans. However, we have vehicles the human body, we're all in these vehicles, and I think we're just, subject to external influences. Do you think that the ancients knew exactly that, Walter? Do you think that knew they were subject to this, and that's why they tried to map the fall from grace, these precessional cycles? Do you think that was the key thing?
I think that's part of it. So if you use the 4 ages, and I like the Greek terms, iron, bronze, silver, and golden age, just because it's easy to mm-hmm. remember,
mm-hmm.
That the lowest age, the iron age, is the time when man only can perceive things through his 5 senses, and he feels everything is physical. There's nothing beyond the physical. He has no knowledge of molecules, no knowledge of atoms, no knowledge of electricity, magnetism, the way we're communicating nowadays and halfway across the world through electrons. He has no knowledge that that's possible. It would seem like magic to him. And then in the next age, the age of the hero, Bronze Age, that we're just entering, we begin to master these finer forces and use them for all sorts of things. And that's what's happening right now. And then the age after this, supposedly telepathy and clairvoyance, are common knowledge. And the earth starts to become a pretty peaceful place because, heck, if you can know somebody's thoughts, generally you're not going to get in a fight with them. Nobody's lying to each other.
For sure. Walter, I'm just going
to... Then the golden age, of course, it's beyond our comprehension. Mankind supposedly lives in tune with nature, and as Hesiod said, the earth gives of itself freely.
For sure. Walter, just going to take a quick break. I'm going to be back in just a moment. Hi everybody, and welcome back to Capricorn Radio. We're talking to my good friend Walter Cruthington, author of Lost Star of Myth and Time, and also hosts the CPAC conference, which is running this year. I think it's a biannual conference. Is that right, Walter?
It is. Well, we've done it most years. We took a break last year, but this is the 9th annual. And we'll have quite a number of good speakers that are all looking at this idea that the Earth moves in these vast cycles, and we learn a lot by studying ancient cultures.
Yeah, I've got Shock on in the next hour. Dr. Robert Shock, we're going to talk about his Egypt tour and Göbekli Tepe and the CPAC conference as well. He's got some interesting stuff to talk about. Gary Evans is also going to be speaking there. You got quite an interesting lineup. Lars Scranton as well. Lars has been on a couple of times, got an interesting book coming out on China as well. Yeah, I mean,
Laird's really pieced together some of the very early languages and found out that
the lexicons are similar.
Yeah, they're just really advanced. You know, there's information within each letter about the meaning of the letter, and it's quite profound, his work. Also, Dean Radin is going to be there this year, and he'll be talking about, you know, one of the great old texts, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which is sort of like a map to higher consciousness. And, you know, here's a book that's thousands of years old, and more and more people today are starting to recognize the tremendous wisdom in this book. So he'll be pointing out how much knowledge ancient cultures had as he kind of walks us through some of Patanjali's work.
Wow. Where will people get tickets at, Walter? cpaconline.com, is that correct?
Yeah, it's just cpakonline.com. Go there and register there. You know, it's a nice event. We do some hikes before the conference.
Oh.
And we provide, you know, breakfast and lunch. So it's really nicely done. It's at the Westin Hotel in beautiful Rancho Mirage. So it's very, very casual. We have some music on Friday night, and you know, we try to stimulate conversation between the speakers and everybody that's attending. And we usually get into some great conversations.
Yeah, I see you have Amish Shah on as well. I think I pronounced that right. I've had Amish on the show before. And also Marie Jones as well. She's got an awesome book on viral mythology. Really enjoyed that.
Yeah. I'm talking to one or two others too that aren't up there yet, but I'm expecting John Daring's going to be joining us, and he is a scientist at Sarah, and really has some interesting, almost breakthrough work about how this motion through space, how it actually affects our magnetosphere, our atmosphere, and changes consciousness. So he's going to have a good talk.
Isn't there something about the heliosphere, Walter? You just triggered a memory there. Isn't there something about the heliosphere that's not the same? It's not symmetrical. It's like an asymmetrical effect.
Yes, yeah. We did a paper on that once. You know, when they sent the first two Pioneer probes out, it was something like 30 years ago. They only recently reached the edge of solar system. And they had expected that they would, you know, if they were going out of a sphere, then they both would have reached it about the same number of miles from the sun. But in fact, one reached it like, 8 billion miles. Another one took 10 billion miles to reach it. They were going different directions.
It's quite a difference, isn't it?
Yeah. And so that was the first major clue that the heliosphere is not a sphere at all. That, and now there's a number of hypotheses that the solar system might be shaped more like a bullet. And,
Wow.
Question is, where are we going?
Yeah. So again, that lends to the hypothesis we got something massive doing that, like a dark star or a heavy body.
Yeah, there's some big forces out there, you know, and of course we don't understand most of them. Dark matter is, they don't understand what that's all about. When the when the term was first coined, people just thought, oh, they're big planets that we can't see. And when we get telescopes good enough, we'll be able to see these things. And of course, you didn't find anything there. And so the theory then switched to WIMPs, weak intermittently active massive particles or something. And nobody's been able to find these WIMPs. And so that comprises like over a third of the universe, and nobody can find dark matter. But even more mysterious is dark energy. You know, it comprises pretty much the rest of the universe. There's got to be massive energy to be, you know, sending all the galaxies out at what appears to be an accelerating rate. And so it just shows you really how little we understand when we get out to very big space. Just like when we get down to the quantum field, we understand very little.
Yeah. You know, Walter, for me, call me a dreamer, but I just think, you know, with the latest discoveries of Bidden and the dwarf planets and them not making sense, and they only make sense if there's something like a heavy object near us affecting them, I think it's down tools and focus all efforts on this. That's what I think, but it's not the case with the scientific doctrine out there, Walter.
Well, there's some people that are really looking, like Mike Brown, like the Spanish astronomers, but they're using traditional means, and I think the main assumption there is that the solar system isn't moving. Once you put the solar system in motion, particularly at a high rate of speed, you then have the possibility that visible stars might be causing these patterns, these periodicities that we see. So,
well, if we had a hypothesis, let's say we have a dwarf planet out there, red dwarf, and it's whatever distance from us, and we're orbiting that in a elliptical motion. Maybe we also are somehow linked in with Sirius or another star as well. Maybe it's such a complex motion that there's a host of variables. Forgive the complexity of it, but perhaps it's more complex than we could even imagine. It could be both scenarios.
Yeah, it could be, but the universe has been around for a long time. Our solar system's estimated to be over 5 billion years old, and they have, when things first started, the theories were that things were chaotic, that, a cooling nebula, things are bumping into each other until the planets, are sort of rounded, and then anything that's sort of not in a harmony or resonance eventually crashes into something else, and so you eliminate those objects, and you get down to a group of planets and moons and asteroids that are in fairly good resonance with one another. And so when we find these outer planets, these dwarf planets, we have to apply that same assumption that they exist because of, they're working in harmony with what the other planets are. And so the periodicities we find there, I think, is the most astounding thing to me if you've studied the Great Year. So the Great Year is 24,000 years. And so Sedna's, it's one of the big ones out there. It's 12,000 years. It's exactly one half of the Great Year. That's just a perfect resonance, for every one binary motion, Sedna goes back and forth twice. And all the rest of these we're finding have similar periodicities either to the Great Year or to the motion of Sirius B around Sirius A. Which seems to act kind of like a pendulum. And I wrote a little bit about that in my book, Lost Star. But if you start to understand that things cannot just be chaotic forever for billions and billions of years, they slowly sort of simmer down and you get your pace and you work things out, then you realize something is driving all these planets, and you look for things that are sync with those periodicities. And I think that drives us too serious, quite frankly.
Let's talk cataclysms, Atlantis, if you will. I think, if the ancients, going back, how far do you want to go back? 3000 BC and beyond. I mean, maybe they were privy to other knowledge because they were living it. Maybe they were living through comet strikes, asteroid strikes. I think, with the comets that are on the outer solar system getting maybe disturbed with another heavy body coming nearby, Walter, maybe these guys figured out precession because, they were living it. They were in trouble. You think cataclysms tie in, Walter, with all this?
Yeah, I think cataclysms happen from time to time and, really screw up the, historical record. Obviously, a lot of information goes missing and, makes the dark age seem even darker than it was because so much was lost. Certainly there's, a lot of myth and folklore about the Atlantis fable. And we have one of our speakers will be talking about that. He says he has some new evidence, Jay Yoon. And so he's going to be at CPAC.
Wow.
Presenting, some evidence for a Caribbean strike that would fit a lot of the accounts of Atlantis.
Wow. Let's talk Göbekli Tepe because I know, I guess Shock's going to be talking about Göbekli Tepe. I know he's quite hot on this at the moment. I think this is incredibly important because of the time frame. I think there's so many people interested in this now. Pay homage to Klaus Schmidt. I know the guy's not with us anymore, the original excavator. I think it's going to probably slow things up. However, we've got enough on Göbekli Tepe to really wake up now, Walter, and say something's happened at the 10,000 BC era.
Yeah, and what a great thing for Shock, too, because, he was sort of put down by the Egyptologist establishment for claiming that the Sphinx could be older than 5,000 years. He was just doing it based on the limestone wear, looking at it as a geologist, but it didn't fit the archaeological story. And so he took all this guff from these other scientists with the main reason being, hey, Shock, if there was something that preceded Egypt, we would have found it by now. And unless you can find something big, much older than Egypt, we just aren't going to believe you. And so, sure enough, 20 years go by and they find Göbekli Tepe. And it would have been completely lost had it not been purposely buried 9,000 years ago. And that's what makes it so amazing. These huge pillars with these carved bas-reliefs and their positioning, really, to me, it looks like some sort of stellar alignments, but a lot more work needs to be done to figure that out.
He's got more than the potsherds now. They asked him, where's the potsherds of this mystery civilization, in a quite cynical way, and he has more than potsherds now. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's more than potsherds. And even some of the motifs around those huge pillars, he has been relating to other places in the world, which I know he'll probably talk a little bit about Eastern Island because they wear the same sort of belt that the
and the
fingers
and the fingers around the belly or the tummy, the fingers seem to be long and elongated and the same posture as well.
Yeah. So fascinating work. My hat's off to Robert Schock, and I'm really glad he's going to join us at CPAC this year, as well as Gary, who's getting into archaeoacoustics. They're both great guys, both doing great research.
Sure. Walter, let's talk about ancient roads, because I'm looking at a paper you wrote here. This is fascinating stuff, Walter. This is unprecedented here. Yeah,
so, they found all these straight roads throughout the world that go back to prehistoric times, meaning they're before history. We don't know who built them. But it's been a series of revelations to actually come to that conclusion.
Wow.
Because in England, for example, I think the main road there is A6.
Yeah, up north, yeah.
Right. And so back in the 1800s, it was claimed that road is only 100 years old, used by farmers. And then the great British Empire helped to build that road so nice and straight. Well, then, of course, some people doubted that story, and in the early 20th century, it was discovered that there's a lot of Roman structures evidence around these roads, and that they're very similar to Roman roads. And so it was then assumed that, okay, they're not a couple hundred years old, they're 2,000 years old, built by the Romans. And just recently, for A6 in England, they came across the discovery that there's Mesolithic villages all along this road. And so suddenly it goes from not 2,000 years old to maybe 6,000 or 8,000 years old, because the Mesolithic artifacts are, pretty much built right into the road.
Wow.
And you find them elsewhere in the world too. I in that article I sent there, I used one that they found in the Americas in Chaco Canyon area.
Oh yeah, I've had Gary David on before talking Chaco Canyon. I love that place. It's absolutely fascinating, Walter, and so many anomalies with the straight roads there as well. Yeah,
one of the neat anomalies there is that the road will just go absolutely straight into a cliff, and then that cliff might be 1,000 feet high, and then the road continues absolutely straight at the top of the cliff.
Wow.
And so you wonder, what are these for? Obviously, they're not, not just taking horses and carts on them. There's some other reason. They're almost like Nazca lines.
Like processional routes maybe for walking, or?
Yeah, I don't know. I really don't know. So,
fascinating astronomical culture, the Chaco Canyon culture.
Yeah. We had one of the scientists who was with the U.S. Geological Survey when they set up Chaco Canyon. He mapped the boundaries, and he told us some interesting stories. He said once they had a crew out there, 5 or 6 people, and they were scattered around the main part of the canyon. And he was at one place near the wall, and he could hear people talking over a mile away.
Wow.
And he realized that, this canyon wall has been modified to sort of a natural amphitheater, and that there's a certain place out there that if you just talk or whisper, you can hear it all the way up to the wall. And so that was one of his discoveries, that whoever built this place, and I mean, we say it's the Anastasi now, but that's just a name because we don't know, somehow modified this structure to be an area where they could, have some huge performances in, or something like that. We're not quite sure.
I once read a paper, Walter, that we somehow orbit the Pleiades star Alcyone. Is that in a precessional sense?
So there's a few cycles we've talked about. We've talked about the daily cycle caused by the Earth's spin. We've talked about the yearly cycle by the Earth's orbit. We've talked about the precessional cycle by the binary motion, our star around another nearby star. Mm-hmm. And there's supposed to be another cycle that some of the Indian cultures talk about, the universal cycle, and it's where the entire stellar neighborhood goes around an even more distant object. And,
wow. Like a super precession in a way.
Yeah. And so some say that that's, it's a cycle that's millions of years long, that it bottomed out in 3000 BC. So even before our recent dark ages, it's one reason why things were so tough. We were sort of at the bottom of the bottom of the barrel.
Wow.
And, but yeah, a few people have hypothesized that maybe the Pleiades, Alcyone, is the center for that particular one. And there's a lot of myth and folklore, of course, about the halcyon days, the days of wine and plenty, when we're closer to Alcyone, that things are wonderful and beautiful.
Again, that would lend to some sort of an energetic effect on little old Earth in a consciousness sense, or some sort of a planetary effect again.
Yeah. Yeah. Even in the book of Job, the Old Testament, and I think that one goes back to, roughly 3000 BC. The scholars argue about it a little bit, but that's 6,000 years ago. So you still have some memories of the last higher age. And what does he say? He says, canst thou, I'm paraphrasing, but canst thou hang on to the sweet influence of the Pleiades or loose the bands of Orion? Mm-hmm. And it's sort of a rhetorical question, in my opinion, mm-hmm. in that, no, you can't hang on to that higher age. It's a cycle, any more than you can hang on to the morning of a given day or the summer of a given year. I mean, the cycle has to go on, and you can't hang on to that cycle any more than you look up at the stars of Orion's belt and break them apart. So it's interesting that here's something 6,000 years is mentioned in the Pleiades, and almost referring to, the desire to want to hang on to this golden age, and yet realizing that you can't do that.
Mm. You also have another paper there, Walter, about they found the sun's sibling star. It's like same composition as the sun. This could actually maybe explain the neighborhood that we're in and where we kind of all originated from in terms of its solar creation, the creation of our own sun.
Yeah, I posted that because I saw it was so similar in composition to our own sun. Of course, it's quite a bit of ways, but it leads to speculations about, okay, how quickly are things moving if we came from the same sort of nebula nursery,
drifting apart at a certain rate.
Right. And so I love all this work because someday somebody's really going to be able to plot how things have moved in our local stellar neighborhood, and that'll be really cool. It's
another fascinating angle on it. I just think it's nice to know if we could map out a few suns similar to our own, then we could probably say, well, we all scattered in it from a common point in one direction, I think.
Maybe so, yeah. Mm. Also a good place to look in the future for habitable planets, if you want something kind of like Earth.
For sure. Walter, give us out your websites again. Of course, you don't just do the Binary Research Institute. You do many things. But you give us the book website and the Binary Research Institute website.
Sure. Well, the CPAC website is cpakonline.com. And so anybody interested in the conference and hearing the real experts, just go to cpakonline.com. You can find out more about my general work at the Binary Research Institute. And a little bit unrelated, James, but mention it.
Sure.
We've started a company here that's sort of taking advantage of the higher trends and using electrons. It's called Acorns. It's a way to save and invest by sort of pulling money out of the air.
Sure.
And so anybody want to see what I do for my day job? It's acorns.com. It's actually something I'm doing with my kid. It's a very cool app that can help people save and invest in ways heretofore impossible.
Wow, fascinating. You must work long hours, Walter, to be doing all this.
Yeah, but I love it.
Yeah. Wow, Walter, 160 plus shows since I spoke to you last. So much has happened in the world. So many new findings. I'm going to refer people back to the original show we did. We did a great show on Lost Star of Myth and Time. We could talk for hours and hours about the astronomical data and precession of the equinox and ancient cultures, Walter. There's so much in this. I guess tell little people about you, Walter, that I haven't heard the first show, and tell us about the Binary Research Institute and what you do there.
Sure, and then we can talk about some of the new discoveries also.
Sure.
Yeah, by way of background, I'm the director of the Binary Research Institute, and that's where we look at solar system motion and its effect on cycles of time and consciousness. Mm-hmm. So just as the Earth spins on its axis and it gives you the cycle of day and night, and our bodies are adapted to that, so we actually go into a subconscious state, during the night, and plant life shuts down, photosynthesis doesn't occur, blah, blah, blah. And just as the Earth orbits the sun in 365 days and causes the cycle of the seasons, mm-hmm. and again, more profound things happen, trillions of things spring out of the ground, bloom, fruit, then decay again, and billions of other larger life forms will migrate or spawn en masse. Mm-hmm. And we hardly think about it, but it's caused just by these simple celestial motions. So the ancients seem to be fascinated by a third motion, one that is very obscure nowadays, called the precession of the equinox. But according to Giorgio de Santillana, the former professor of the history of science at MIT, mm-hmm. He said that over 30 ancient cultures were aware of this cycle and seem to all relate it to the rise and fall of civilization.
Hamlet's Mill he wrote.
Pardon?
Hamlet's Mill. He wrote the awesome book, Hamlet's Mill. Exactly.
Yeah. It's outstanding. I had to read it 3 or 4 times because it's so deep.
Sure.
But it's a treasure trove of information on this idea that ancient cultures around the world believe that history or consciousness would rise and fall in this vast cycle of time with the precession of the equinox. It takes, roughly 24,000 years. And so, when I was a little boy, I read about history. My mom bought me a lot of books on ancient cultures, and I'd read about how advanced Sumer, Akkad, Babylon were. They had sewer systems, indoor plumbing, and same thing with Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, the Indus Valley. They built with uniform brick systems and, again, had tremendous waterworks. And both of these cultures, as well as the Egyptian culture and many others, just almost became nomadic civilizations by the time of the Dark Ages. And yet in school they taught me, well, things are pretty linear. This is the way things work. And I just thought it didn't make sense. Mm-hmm. So it was always in the back of my mind. And then I came across a spiritual book, The Holy Science by Swami Sri Yukteswar. Mm-hmm. And he's explaining, the Enlightenment process. And just a matter of fact, in the introduction of the book, almost in passing, he says that, the reason mankind doesn't understand these things right now is because we're in a low age. And this age is caused by our solar system moving around another star, and we're farther from it. We're, close to the Dark Ages, and we're closer to it. We're in a higher age. Mm. And so that was the sort of the clue, the cue that got me just a little over 12,000 years before our last Dark Age. You had a Golden Age, mm-hmm. and then we had the pit of our Dark Age, roughly 500 AD or so. And we've been creeping out of it since then with sort of a burst of activity with the Renaissance. That means, rebirth of the cycle. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so we're back on the upswing. And, of course, Plato called this the Great Year. And so in the first film I did, we called it the Great Year using Plato's terminology. But really, James, so many cultures talked about it in so many ways, and it's the Indians who have the most detail on it. They break it into the Kali, Dwapara, Treta, and Satya Yugas, and give us just a rich amount of information that can be really helpful to living our lives nowadays, I think, when we properly understand this larger cycle.
Walter, with the Binary Research Institute, you don't mess around. You've got a lot of astronomical scientific research papers and a lot of great minds in the Institute. Now, the thing is, do you come at this from a consciousness, spirituality point of view and look for the science to marry or match in with the evidence from ancient cultures or the sophistication of what these guys had? Or do you come at it from an astronomical point of view and then sometimes later match in the ancient evidence?
That's a good question. Find out if this is true, then it's the most astounding information I've ever heard. It explains, why history has cycles in it. And that's when I formed the Institute, 12, 14 years ago now, and started hiring astrophysicists, astronomers to really seriously look into this. And sure enough, we found that the current theory of precession is just riddled with holes, so much so that they change it every 10 years.
Wow.
And Newton's equations didn't even work, his original equations. So nowadays they have 4,000 inputs into this precession model to try to predict the changing rate of precession each year.
I think sorry, Walter, I think one of the most important things is, everybody thinks that precession is figured out, and we really never had a clue about it in the first place, and still have very little clue about it today. I think you're pioneering a lot of stuff. You actually, I got to bring in Gravity Probe B, because this, Walter, for me is like fascinating that, you actually had correspondence with these guys, about the Gravity Probe B. So maybe talk a little bit about that, Walter.
Yes. So, we figured out that, precession can be better explained by this, the motion of the solar system rather than the simple wobbling of the Earth. And that means that